The laughter started before I even reached the table. Not loud, not open, the kind that slips between coughs and whispers, meant to remind you that you don't belong. I heard it anyway. You always do. When a man walks into a courtroom alone, people notice. When that man is about to lose everything, they enjoy it. I stood there for a second longer than necessary, the double doors closing behind me with a soft, final sound. No lawyer at my side, no briefcase, just a thin folder under my arm and the weight of every eye in the room pressing into my back. Someone behind me muttered, "Is he serious?" Another voice answered, amused, "Guess he couldn't afford one." I didn't turn around. Across the room, my wife sat with her legal team. 3 of them, perfectly arranged, suits sharp, expressions calm. She didn't laugh. She didn't need to. The confidence on her face did all the talking. She already knew how this was supposed to end. The judge hadn't even entered yet, and the verdict felt decided. I walked to the defendant's table and sat down alone. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. Too loudly. It drew more attention than I wanted, but that was unavoidable. Everything about being alone in court is loud. Your breathing, your movements, your silence. My wife finally looked at me then, just for a second. Her eyes flicked over my empty chair, my bare table, the lack of anyone whispering strategy into my ear. The corner of her mouth lifted. Not a smile, more like confirmation, as if something she'd predicted had just come true. This was exactly how she wanted it to look. The bailiff called the room to order. Everyone stood as the judge entered, robes flowing, face already set in mild irritation. He'd seen hundreds of cases like this. He knew the pattern. A represented spouse on one side, an unrepresented one on the other. Power and panic, control and collapse. We sat. The judge scanned the room, eyes moving from one table to the other. He paused when he reached mine. That pause lasted half a second too long. "Mr. Carter," he said, checking the file, "I don't see counsel listed for you." "No, Your Honor," I replied. A murmur rippled through the gallery, quiet but satisfied. The judge leaned back slightly. "Are you planning to represent yourself today?" "Yes." He sighed, not dramatically, but enough to signal inconvenience. "You understand this is a family court proceeding involving substantial assets." "I do." "And you're aware of the risks of proceeding without representation?" "Yes, Your Honor." Another glance at the file. Another pause. This one heavier. Across the aisle, one of my wife's attorneys leaned toward her, whispering something with a grin. She nodded once, slow and composed, never taking her eyes off me. She looked relaxed, victorious, like someone watching a building collapse exactly according to plan. The judge cleared his throat. "Very well. Let the record reflect that Mr. Carter has waived his right to counsel." Waived, as if I were giving something up. The clerk began organizing documents. The sound of paper echoed in the sudden quiet. I could feel the room settling into expectation. This was the part where I was supposed to stumble, where I would realize too late that I'd made a mistake, where regret would finally show on my face. It didn't. My wife's lead attorney stood smoothly. "Your Honor, if I may, given that Mr. Carter is unrepresented, we would like to request an expedited review of the financial disclosures already submitted." Of course they did. The judge nodded. "Proceed." The attorney launched into it, rehearsed, confident, ruthless. He spoke about omissions, about inconsistencies, about my supposed inability to manage complex financial matters during the marriage. Every sentence painted the same picture. An unprepared man drowning in a process he didn't understand. I listened without interrupting. I let him finish. When he finally sat down, satisfied, the judge looked at me again. This time there was something else in his expression. Not sympathy. Curiosity. "Mr. Carter," he said slowly, "do you wish to respond?" "Yes," I said. I stood, buttoned my jacket, and faced the bench. "But not yet." A flicker of confusion crossed his face. "Not yet?" "No, Your Honor. I believe it would be more appropriate to wait until the court finishes reviewing the full record." The attorney scoffed quietly. Someone in the gallery laughed. My wife tilted her head slightly, studying me like a puzzle she already knew the answer to. The judge considered me for a moment, then nodded. Very well. He picked up the file again. Thick, heavier than most. As he flipped through the first pages, his brow tightened almost imperceptibly. Then he reached the section with the formal identification. He read my wife's name aloud. And for the first time since I walked into that room, the laughter stopped. The judge didn't react immediately. He just stared at the page longer than necessary, eyes scanning the name again, slower this time. You could feel the shift before anyone understood it. The room leaned forward without realizing it. My wife noticed it too. Her posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. One of her attorneys leaned in, whispering something, but she didn't respond. Her eyes were locked on the bench now, watching the judge's face instead of mine. He cleared his throat once, then again. The name sat there in black ink. Formal, complete. Not just a surname, but a lineage. The kind that doesn't belong in a routine divorce proceeding. The kind judges remember. He flipped to the next page, then back again. His fingers tightened slightly on the file. "Mrs. Carter," he said at last, looking up. "For the record, can you confirm your full legal name?" She hesitated. Just a beat. Just long enough. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied. Her voice was steady, but it took effort now. She repeated it, exactly as written. The reaction in the room was delayed, like thunder after lightning. A few lawyers in the gallery exchanged looks. Someone stopped mid-note. One of the clerks glanced up sharply, then back down as if she'd seen something she wasn't supposed to. The judge leaned back in his chair. "I see," he said quietly. My wife's lead attorney stood again, a little too quickly. "Your Honor, if I may, the name is irrelevant to the matter at hand. We're here to discuss—" The judge raised a hand, not forcefully, calmly. "I am aware of why we're here. I'm also aware of the court's responsibility to understand the full context of the parties involved." He turned another page, then another. Silence stretched. Not the uncomfortable kind from before. This was different, focused, heavy, like the room itself was holding its breath. I sat back down. This was the moment people later remembered incorrectly. They would say the judge looked angry or shocked or impressed. The truth was simpler. He looked cautious. Across from me, my wife finally glanced my way again. This time, there was no confidence in her eyes. There was calculation. A silent question. "What did you do?" Her attorney leaned in close, whispering urgently now. I caught fragments. It shouldn't matter. Different jurisdiction. Old associations. She nodded once sharply, as if cutting him off. The judge placed the file down on the bench. "Before we proceed further," he said, "I'm going to ask a few clarifying questions." He looked directly at my wife. "Mrs. Carter, are you related to the Carter-Holloway family of—" "Yes," she said quickly. Too quickly. "But that has no bearing on—" The judge held up a finger. Again, calm, controlled, final. "It's may, depending on what comes next." The temperature in the room dropped, not physically, but perceptibly. People straightened. The casual interest evaporated. This was no longer entertainment. My wife's second attorney opened his mouth, then closed it. The third was already flipping through papers, searching for something that should have been there and wasn't. The judge turned to me. "Mr. Carter," he said, studying me with new eyes, "you stated earlier that you wish to respond later." "Yes, Your Honor." "Is this later?" I stood. "Yes." Every sound in the room seemed amplified as I moved. The scrape of my chair, the rustle of fabric. Somewhere behind me, someone exhaled sharply. "I came here alone today because representation would have complicated matters unnecessarily." A ripple moved through the gallery. My wife's attorney scoffed, but there was no humor in it this time. I continued. "This marriage was never what it appeared to be on paper, and neither was the financial arrangement surrounding it." The judge's gaze never left my face. "You're suggesting concealment." "I'm stating fact. And I'm prepared to submit documentation to support it, some of which this court has already encountered before, though not under this context." That landed. The judge's eyes flicked back to the file. Just briefly. Enough. My wife stood abruptly. "Your Honor, this is absurd. He's trying to intimidate the court with my family name because he knows he has no case. I turned to her the first time since entering the room. No, I said, calmly. I'm trying to prevent this court from being used the way it's been used before. The judge's jaw tightened. Mrs. Carter, please sit down. She didn't move first. Then she did. He looked back at me. What exactly are you alleging, Mr. Carter? I took a breath. That this divorce, he said, is the smallest part of what you're about to uncover. The silence that followed wasn't broken by laughter. It was broken by the judge reaching for his gavel, not to strike it, but to move it closer. The judge didn't strike the gavel. He rested his hand on it, fingers spread, as if grounding himself before stepping onto unstable ground. Mr. Carter, he said, this court will not entertain vague insinuations. If you're making an allegation, you will state it clearly. Yes, Your Honor. I opened the thin folder I'd carried in with me. The sound was soft, almost insignificant, but it cut through the room sharper than any raised voice. People leaned forward again, not out of amusement this time, out of instinct. My wife's family, I said, has a documented history of civil proceedings involving asset shielding, shell ownership, and strategic marital contracts used to redirect liability. Her lead attorney was already on his feet. Objection. This is defamatory and completely outside the scope of— Sit down, the judge said, sharply now. The attorney froze, slowly sat. The judge looked at me again. You're claiming this marriage was used as a financial instrument. Yes. And you came to that conclusion when? Before we married, I said. That did it. A wave of quiet disbelief moved through the room. Someone actually laughed, a short, disbelieving sound, then stopped when no one joined in. The judge raised an eyebrow. Then why proceed with it at all? I didn't answer immediately, not because I didn't have one, but because timing matters. Because, I said finally, walking away would have made me irrelevant. Staying made me admissible. My wife stood again, her chair tipped back hard enough to draw a flinch from one of her attorneys. This is insane, she said. He's spinning a narrative because he's cornered. He wants leverage, sympathy. The judge looked at her, unimpressed. Mrs. Carter, you've had leverage since you walked into this courtroom with 3 attorneys. You'll wait your turn. She stared at him, stunned. She wasn't used to that tone, not from people like him. I slid a single document across a table toward the clerk. This, I said, is a copy of a sealed civil judgment from 14 years ago. Different jurisdiction, different defendant, same family trust. The clerk hesitated before touching it, then glanced at the judge, who nodded once. As she passed it up, the judge's expression changed, not dramatically, not visible to anyone who didn't know what to look for. Recognition. He flipped through the pages faster now, too fast for casual reading, the way someone flips when they already know what they're looking for. Across the aisle, one of my wife's attorneys leaned close to her ear and whispered something urgent, her face drained of color. That case was settled, she said quickly. It was resolved without admission of wrongdoing. Settled, I echoed, not dismissed, and not forgotten. The judge looked up. Mr. Carter, how did you obtain this document? Through discovery, and a matter unrelated to my marriage, at the time. At the time, he repeated. Yes, Your Honor. I was not always who I appeared to be. That landed harder than I expected. Not because it was threatening, because it was true. The judge set the document down carefully, he said. You understand that if what you're implying is accurate, this court's jurisdiction may expand significantly. I do. And that false statements here would expose you to serious consequences. I'm aware. He studied me for a long moment, long enough for the gallery forgot to breathe. Then he turned to my wife's legal team. Counsel, he said, were you aware of your client's family's involvement in this prior sealed judgment? The lead attorney hesitated, just long enough. No, Your Honor, we were not informed. The judge nodded slowly. Then I suggest you ask why. My wife didn't look at them. She was looking at me now, really looking, as if trying to see past the version of me she'd always relied on. You planned this, she said quietly. Yes, I replied, from the moment you insisted on handling the finances alone. Her lips parted, then pressed together. Too late to deny it now. The judge leaned forward. "This court," he said, "will not proceed with an expedited review." A murmur rippled through the room. "Effective immediately, we're suspending all motions related to asset division pending further examination." My wife's attorney jumped up. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. So is discovering undisclosed connections to prior sealed judgments mid-proceeding. Sit down." Silence. The judge looked back at me. "Mr. Carter," he said, "if you have more, now would be the time." I nodded. "I do. But the next part doesn't belong to me." He frowned slightly. "Explain." "It belongs," I said evenly, "to the record your court sealed 12 years ago." The judge's face hardened. I thought so much, and for the first time since I walked into that courtroom alone, I knew for certain they weren't laughing anymore.
The judge reached for the file again, slower this time, as if the weight of it had changed. He turned a few pages back, then stopped at a section marked with a faded red tab. The kind of tab clerks use when they expect to return to something later, the kind that never gets removed. 12 years ago, he said, not looking up, this court handled a civil matter involving a private trust, 3 intermediary corporations, and a marital contract used to redirect liability after a regulatory violation. No one spoke. My wife's attorneys had gone completely still. One of them had his pen frozen midair, like a bad habit he couldn't quite stop. That case, the judge continued, was sealed at the request of multiple parties, including a family with significant political and financial reach. He finally looked up. The Carter-Holloway family. My wife closed her eyes for half a second, just long enough for the mask to slip. The judge turned to her. "Mrs. Carter, were you aware that this court has prior sealed familiarity with your family's legal structures?" "Yes," she said. Her voice was controlled again now. Too controlled. "But that has nothing to do with my marriage." I spoke before the judge could respond. "It has everything to do with it," I said. "The structure is identical." The judge's eyes flicked to me. Identical how? Same trust language, same asset buffering timelines, same marital liability transfer clauses. The only difference is the name on the spouse. A ripple of tension moved through the room. People weren't whispering anymore. They were watching, quietly, carefully. One of my wife's attorneys stood. His voice was tight. "Your Honor, even if there were similarities, that does not prove intent. Families reuse legal frameworks all the time." "True," the judge replied, "but they don't usually reuse them in cases that end up sealed for abuse of process." That landed hard. My wife turned sharply toward her legal team. "Why is he allowed to say this?" The judge answered instead, "Because he's not speculating, he's correlating." He tapped the file. "And because I've seen this before." The room changed again, this time decisively. The judge turned to the clerk. "Pull the archived supplement, the one attached to docket." He paused, then said the number quietly. The clerk's eyes widened. "Yes, Your Honor." As she stood and hurried toward the back, my wife finally looked unsettled. Not angry, not defensive, cornered. "You came here alone to embarrass me," she said under her breath. "No," I replied just as quietly. "I came here alone so no one could say this wasn't my voice." The clerk returned carrying a thin envelope, old, yellowed at the edges. She handed it to the judge with both hands. He opened it. Inside were 3 pages. He read the first, then the second. He didn't get to the third before he stopped. "This," he said slowly, "is a judicial note." He looked up at my wife. "Written by my predecessor." Her attorney spoke quickly now, words tumbling over each other. "Your Honor, with respect, internal notes are not findings, but they are context, and context matters." He read aloud. "Pattern observed. Marital relationships introduced immediately prior to asset migration. Spousal ignorance claimed. Repetition likely." The words hung in the air like smoke. My wife stood again.
This time, no one told her to sit. That note, she said, was never meant to be read in open court. No, the judge agreed, it wasn't. He looked directly at her. Neither was your marriage. Silence crashed down, heavy, final. The judge closed the envelope. Mr. Carter, you stated earlier that you knew before you married. Yes. Then answer me this. Why stay married long enough for this court to see the pattern again? I met his gaze. Because patterns only matter when they repeat. The judge leaned back slowly. I see. And for the first time since the hearing began, he struck the gavel. Not to end something, but to begin it. The gavel's echo hadn't fully faded before the judge spoke again. This court is reopening review under expanded scope, he said, effective immediately. One of my wife's attorneys rose halfway out of his chair. Your Honor, this exceeds the authority of... This court has the authority to protect itself from manipulation, the judge snapped, and from being used as a laundering mechanism for civil liability. That word hit harder than anything else so far. Laundering. My wife finally looked shaken. Not panicked, not yet, but the certainty she'd worn like armor was cracking. The judge turned to the clerk. Notify financial oversight. I want an immediate hold placed on all marital asset transfers pending review. The clerk nodded, already typing. My wife's lead attorney stood fully now. Your Honor, freezing assets without a finding is precisely what this court did 12 years ago, the judge said coldly, and regretted not doing sooner. That shut him up. I felt the room pivot. The divorce had vanished. This wasn't about who got what anymore. This was about whether the system itself had been played. Again. The judge looked at me. Mr. Carter, you stated you were aware of this pattern before marriage. You also stated you entered the marriage deliberately. Yes. Then explain why you didn't alert authorities earlier. I'd expected that question. It always comes eventually. Because exposure without continuity looks like accusation, not proof. The judge considered that, slowly nodded. Continue. My wife's family relies on timing. Short windows, clean breaks. They move assets through marriages because divorce creates urgency. Courts want resolution. They push to close files. My wife shook her head. This is insane. No, I said, it's efficient. Her attorneys were whispering urgently now. I heard fragments. Containment, jurisdiction, media risk. The judge raised his voice. Counsel, if you have something to say, say it. One of them spoke carefully. Your Honor, even if a pattern exists, my client herself has not been charged with any wrongdoing. Yet, the judge replied. Neither had the prior spouse, until 5 years later. That landed. My wife turned toward him sharply. That's not relevant. The judge met her gaze. It is when the same trust language appears, word for word. He turned another page in the file, including a clause that activates only when one party claims financial ignorance under oath. Silence. The judge looked up. Would you like to explain that clause, Mrs. Carter? Her mouth opened, closed. One of her attorneys stepped in. Your Honor, I advise my client not to answer that question at this time. The judge nodded. Wise. He looked back at me. Mr. Carter, you said the next part didn't belong to you. Yes. Then to whom? To the court, and to the spouse before me. The judge's eyes sharpened. You've been in contact. Yes. That sent a shock through the room. My wife spun toward me. You went behind my back? No, I replied. I went in front of the truth. The judge leaned forward. Where is this individual now? Available. And willing. The judge didn't hesitate. Clerk, schedule a supplemental hearing. Subpoena the prior spouse. Freeze all trust-linked marital assets pending testimony. The clerk nodded, fingers moving fast. My wife finally stood again, not in anger now, but desperation. You can't do this. You're destroying my family over his story. The judge looked at her calmly. No, he said. Your family built a structure that only works in silence. He removed that. He turned back to me. One more question, Mr. Carter. Yes, Your Honor. Why now? I met his eyes, because this was the first time someone laughed when I walked in alone. The judge nodded once. Court is adjourned. For now. The gavel struck again, and this time everyone understood. This wasn't over.
The courtroom emptied slower than before. No one rushed out laughing now. People whispered, careful with their words, like sound itself had become evidence. My wife's legal team clustered around her, voices low and urgent, but she barely listened. Her eyes followed me as I gathered my folder and turned toward the exit. For the first time since the marriage began, she didn't look in control. Outside, the hallway felt narrower. Reporters weren't there yet, not officially, but the building has its own pulse. News travels through walls in places like this. By the time the elevator doors closed behind me, the story had already started changing hands. I didn't leave the building. Instead, I took a seat on one of the hard wooden benches near the auxiliary hearing rooms. I knew what would come next. I had planned for it the same way I had planned for everything else. Quietly, patiently, with no audience. 20 minutes later, the clerk found me. "Mr. Carter," she said, lowering her voice, "the judge has requested a private clarification before the supplemental hearing is scheduled." I stood and followed her back down the corridor. No gallery this time, no attorneys, just the judge, the clerk, and a door that closed softly behind me. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit." I did. He studied me without speaking for a long moment. Without the robe, without the bench, he looked older, sharper, less insulated. "You understand," he said finally, "that what you've initiated here doesn't end with your divorce." "Yes. You've implicated structures that operate well beyond this court." "I know." "And you placed yourself directly in their line of sight." I met his gaze. That was unavoidable. He exhaled through his nose. Most people who uncover things like this run. "I wasn't trying to uncover it," I said. "I was trying to document it." He nodded slowly. "There's a difference." He opened a drawer and removed a thin folder, newer than the one from the archive. He slid it across the desk. "This is a summary," he said, "of the sealed case from 12 years ago. What wasn't made public. What never should have stayed buried." I didn't touch it yet. "The prior spouse," he continued, "lost everything. Career, credibility. By the time the truth surfaced, no one cared." "I know. That's why they agreed to testify." The judge's eyes narrowed. "You didn't coerce them." "No. I waited." That earned me another long look. "You're not motivated by money," he said. "No." "Reputation?" I shook my head. That was gone the moment I married her. He leaned back slightly. "Then what?" I didn't answer immediately. "Because systems like this only survive when the cost of speaking is higher than the cost of silence." The judge closed the folder. "You've shifted that balance." Outside the room, voices rose suddenly, sharp, controlled, angry. The judge stood and opened the door just as my wife's lead attorney was demanding access. "You can't hold a private meeting with the opposing party," he snapped. "This is highly inappropriate." The judge stepped into the hall. "This meeting is on record," he said evenly, "and you're welcome to challenge it, in writing." The attorney hesitated. My wife stood behind him, her face pale, jaw tight. "You think you've won," she said to me quietly. I turned to her. "No," I said. "I think this is the part where you realize what winning actually costs." Her attorney pulled her back, whispering urgently. She resisted for a moment, just a moment, then allowed herself to be guided away. The judge watched them go. "Once the prior spouse testifies, this becomes a matter for multiple agencies." "I know." "And your marriage," he added, "will be formally reclassified." I looked at him. "As what?" He paused. "As evidence." The words settled heavily between us.
As I walked out of the building an hour later, the first camera flashes were already going off. Not at me, not yet, but at the doors, at the idea of what was coming. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. Because the next hearing wasn't about exposure. It was about collapse.
The supplemental hearing drew a different kind of crowd. No laughter, no casual observers, just quiet rows of people who understood what institutional risk looked like when it finally surfaced. 2 additional judges sat beside the bench now, not to preside, to witness. That alone said more than any headline could. My wife arrived 10 minutes late. Not late in the careless way, late in the calculated way. She walked in flanked by new counsel, not divorce attorneys anymore, but specialists. The kind hired when the goal isn't to win, but to survive. She didn't look at me. The prior spouse sat 3 rows behind the counsel table. Older than in the photos I'd seen. Thinner, but composed. Someone who had already paid the price once and had nothing left to lose. When court was called to order, the room settled into a silence that felt rehearsed. The judge didn't waste time. This hearing, he said, is not to adjudicate marital disputes. It is to establish continuity. He nodded to the clerk. Call the witness. The prior spouse stood, walked forward, took the oath without hesitation. When they sat, their hands didn't shake. They spoke clearly, methodically. No emotion wasted. They described the marriage, the pressure to stay uninvolved in finances, the sudden push for divorce timed precisely with a regulatory inquiry, the trust documents that appeared overnight, the assurances, the silence afterward. No embellishment, no revenge, just sequence. When my wife's counsel attempted to interrupt, the judge shut it down immediately. Let them finish. And they did. When the testimony ended, the room felt hollowed out, like something essential had been removed and no one knew what would fill the space. The judge turned to my wife. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "you now have an opportunity to respond." She stood slowly. "This is absurd," she said, but the words lacked weight now. "These are interpretations, coincidences. My family operates within the law." One of the additional judges leaned forward slightly. "Then you won't object to a full forensic review." Her counsel spoke quickly. "We will need time to—" "No," the judge said. "You've had time. What you've relied on is discretion." He turned to me. "Mr. Carter," he said, "you entered this marriage knowing what it was." "Yes." "And you stayed." "Yes." "Why testify now instead of walking away clean when you could?" I stood. "Because walking away would have closed a loop, and loops are how this survives." The judge nodded once. "Effective immediately," he said. "This court refers all related trust and marital agreements to federal review. All pending asset motions are denied. The marriage is dissolved without transfer." My wife's head snapped up. "No transfer?" she said. "No benefit," the judge replied, "to either party." Her counsel leaned in urgently. She pushed them away. "You think this makes you righteous," she said to me, her voice sharp now. "You destroyed everything." I met her gaze. "No, I stopped it from happening again." She stared at me, searching for something, regret, doubt, fear. She found none. The gavel struck once. That was it. No applause, no outrage. Just an ending that felt final because it wasn't dramatic. As people began to file out, the prior spouse passed me, paused. "Thank you," they said quietly. I nodded. Nothing more was needed. Behind us, my wife remained standing, surrounded by counsel who were already preparing for a very different fight. And for the first time, she understood something she never had before. This wasn't revenge. It was closure with consequences. The headlines came later. Stripped of context, softened by legal language, words like review, inquiry, restructuring. No one printed what really happened in that courtroom, because what really happened didn't fit cleanly on a page. I wasn't mentioned at all. That was intentional. My wife didn't speak to me after the hearing, not once. By the time the paperwork was finalized, she was already surrounded by people whose job was no longer to win, only to limit damage.
Her name disappeared quietly from boards, foundations, advisory roles. Not erased, just removed. Like something that had become inconvenient to explain. The family closed ranks. They always do. But this time, they closed them inward. The prior spouse testified once more, then vanished back into a life that no longer belonged to anyone else. There were no interviews, no settlements announced, just a correction, years too late, finally entered into a system that pretended it had always known. As for me, I walked away with nothing. No assets, no compensation, no apology. Exactly as planned. A week later, I returned to the courthouse alone, not for a hearing, just to retrieve a copy of the final order. The same clerk handed it to me. She didn't smile. She didn't avoid my eyes either. "Some people asked about you," she said quietly. "What did you tell them?" I asked. "The truth," she replied, "that you didn't ask for anything." I nodded and left. Outside, the city moved like it always had. Cars, phones, conversations that had nothing to do with collapsed structures or sealed files finally unsealed. To everyone else, the world was intact. That's how these systems survive for so long. They rely on normal days. I didn't feel triumph or relief, just a clean absence where tension used to live. The kind you don't notice until it's gone. People think revenge is loud, that it ends with someone on their knees begging, or ruined in public. That's not how it works. Real revenge is procedural. It's patience, timing, letting someone walk confidently into the same pattern one time too many, letting the system recognize itself in the mirror and react the only way it knows how. Weeks later, I ran into my wife by accident, a coffee shop, neutral ground. She looked smaller somehow, not weaker, just reduced. She recognized me immediately. "You planned this from the beginning," she said. No accusation left in her voice, just recognition. "Yes," I replied. "And you stayed anyway." "Yes." She studied me for a long moment. "Why?" I finished my coffee before answering. "Because if I'd left, they would have just replaced me." She didn't respond to that. There was nothing left to say. When I walked out, she didn't follow. That was the real ending. Not the courtroom, not the ruling. The moment when the pattern broke and nothing rushed in to replace it. They laughed when I walked into court alone. They stopped when the judge read her family name. But what none of them understood until it was too late was this. I didn't come to win. I came to make sure it couldn't happen again.